Welcome to Wichita Liberty TV with Bob Weeks.
Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Wichita and Kansas government and politics. We're broadcast on KGPT Channel 26.1, also its companion website, kgpt26.com. Some of you may know me from my blog, The Voice for Liberty. That's on the internet at wichitaliberty.org. There you'll find the motto is individual liberty, limited government, and free markets in Wichita and Kansas. I cover things that may not be covered by the Wichita Eagle or other television stations or radio, or if we do cover the same news, I'll do it from the perspective of economic freedom, limited government, and individual liberty, because these are the things that are important. And these are also the things that are so often under attack by our governments, be it at the federal, state, or local level. So please visit wichitaliberty.org. You can subscribe to the email newsletter I send 2 or 3 times a week. And if you'd like to contact me, you can find my email address and telephone there, or just remember bob.weeks@gmail.com. Well, this week, Washburn University political science professor Mark Peterson wrote an op-ed that was carried in a number of papers, including the Wichita Eagle. He wrote that the actual cost of obtaining post-secondary education has, like everything else, continued to rise, mostly at the rate of inflation plus a tad. Well, that struck me as deserving some more scrutiny, as we see news stories about all the time about the soaring costs of college. So I did a little research. And I found that the College Board keeps track of college costs. And at its website, you can find a table of college tuition and fees. And over the last 30 years, you'll find that at private nonprofit 4-year colleges, these costs are 2.53 times their level in 1983. And these numbers are inflation adjusted, meaning that the cost of college rose 2.53 times as fast as inflation. And for public 4-year colleges, that'd be Wichita State, Kansas State, KU, the rate of increase was higher, 3.31 times the rate of inflation over the past 30 years. Well, Professor Peterson wrote that college costs had risen mostly at the rate of inflation plus a tad, and his language leaves him a little wiggle room, as mostly and tad don't have precise meanings. But evidently the product of the two is a pretty large number. And he also wrote this regarding public post-secondary education, that its price continues to climb and the Kansas General Fund contributes less. But research from the Kansas Policy Institute shows that after adjusting for inflation, state aid to state universities has declined by just 0.1% over the past 10 years. That, I think, qualifies as a tad. Well, this past week also, Wichita Mayor Carl Brewer delivered his annual State of the City address. Now, we expect a certain amount of bragging and over-the-top community pride, things like Wichita is the best place to work and raise a family. Things like that are good to a point. But if we take these boasts seriously, and if they're not based upon factual information, then I believe we have a problem. We may believe that everything is fine in Wichita, but if the facts are contrary, we may take unwise action that ultimately is harmful. Well, here's an example, and perhaps the most important. The mayor said in his address, "Our community partnerships have helped us overcome the challenges of the Great Recession, which brought layoffs to many sectors of our economy." Well, the problem is we really haven't overcome the recession. If we take a look at job growth in Wichita over the past 2 decades, we see Wichita performing very poorly. And that's not only on an absolute basis, but relative to our self-chosen peer cities. The relative part is important because, well, there was a recession after all, and it was nationwide. But note that there are a few cities over which Wichita ranked higher in job growth: Springfield, Illinois, and Wichita Falls, Texas, to name 2. These cities are relevant because we recently hired people from these cities to lead our economic development efforts. Now, I've shown data like this to the city council, and I don't think they believed me. And I can understand their reluctance, as it's not easy to admit things like this. I think that some city council members believe that city hall critics take joy in presenting these figures, but at least for me, that's not true. I realize that these statistics reveal human hardship. So here's a chart prepared by the Wichita Metro Chamber of Commerce for a presentation given to its leadership committee. Now, it uses a different time frame and a different set of peers for comparison, but the result is the same. Wichita lags behind in terms of job growth. Well, despite all this evidence, the mayor thinks we're doing well and is proud of our economic development efforts. In his address, he told the audience this: "For the past 5 years, the Greater Wichita Economic Development Coalition has helped generate nearly 10,000 jobs and more than $400 million in capital investment." Well, 10,000, that sounds like a lot of jobs, but we have to temper that number. We need some context. We know, first of all, that we don't update our job statistics to reflect jobs that didn't last for very long. We also must realize that some of these jobs would have been created without the involvement of our economic development agencies. And we also must realize that these economic development efforts have a cost, and that cost is harmful to our economy and job creation. But even if we give our economic development agencies sole credit for these 10,000 jobs, let's apply a little arithmetic to provide some context. Now, the Bureau of Labor Statistics tells us that the labor force in the Wichita metropolitan area is about 302,000 people. That number, by the way, has been declining since 2009. So if we take the 10,000 jobs, and since that was for 5 years, that averages to 2,000 jobs per year. That's in the neighborhood of 6% of the labor force. Well, does that represent a significant factor in the Wichita area economy? Remember, that calculation gives government way more credit than it deserves. And when we combine this with Wichita's lackluster performance in creating jobs compared to our peers, I really don't think we should be proud of our government's economic development efforts. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. Well, in his State of the City address this week, Wichita Mayor Carl Brewer also said we need to continue to diversify our economy. But we're not doing that. Our economic development programs heavily favor the aviation industry, and that makes it more difficult for aspiring companies and other diverse industries to start and thrive. The mayor told the audience that we will also continue to support our successful Affordable Airfares program. Now, that's the program whereby Wichita and the state of Kansas, Sedgwick County too, we pay a discount airline to provide service in Wichita. It had been AirTran Airways, but it is now Southwest. It is thought that if one airline has low fares, others will reduce their fares to match, and that's probably true. But I've done the research, and there is another effect. As can be seen in this chart, the number of flights and the number of available seats is declining in Wichita. Now, these measures are also declining at the national level, but they're declining faster in Wichita than for the nation as a whole. Well, the mayor also asked for cooperation in using Southwest Airlines, asking the audience, "So when you make your corporate travel plans, please remember our community's commitment to supporting low-cost carriers." Well, I wonder, how would you feel if you worked for one of the other air carriers that does not receive a subsidy, such as American, United, and Delta? In the past, the subsidized discount carrier has carried about 10% of Wichita's passengers. So we're vitally dependent on the legacy or major airlines to carry the other 90% of our traffic, and we don't need to insult them, as I believe the mayor did. Well, water was another topic that the mayor touched on. He told the audience, the city has also invested in the second phase of the Aquifer Storage and Recovery Project known as ASR. New construction was completed in time to help with the drought. More than 100 million gallons were diverted from the Little Arkansas River directly to customers. Well, okay, 100 million gallons sounds like a lot of water, but what is the context? Well, 100 million gallons of water is about how much water we use on a single hot summer day. And what about that ASR, or Aquifer Storage and Recovery Program? Its cost so far for phases 1 and 2 has been $247 million, and 2 more phases are contemplated. Despite this investment, and despite the plan's boasts, Wichitans were threatened with huge fines for excessive water usage last summer. And the Wichita City Council also started a rebate program so that citizens were forced to pay for other people to buy low water usage appliances. And expensive city decorative fountains were dry for a time. Well, why were these measures necessary? There's a city document created in March 2013. Now, it's just as Wichita realized the city was running out of water, and it's titled Wichita Area Future Water Supply, a model program for other municipalities. And it states, in 1993, the Wichita City Council adopted an integrated local water supply plan that identified cost-effective water resources that would be adequate to meet Wichita's water supply needs through the year 2050. Well, that squares with what former Mayor Bob Knight recently told the Wichita Pachyderm Club, which is that while he was in office, Wichita had sufficient water for the next 50 years. And he was told that about 10 years ago. And just to give you an idea of how seriously we should take the claims made in speeches like this, here's what the mayor told us in his 2009 State of the City address. He said, "We will continue work on the state-of-the-art water supply system known as the ASR project. It will provide the Wichita area with sufficient water for the next 50 years. Economic development is not possible without an adequate water supply." Well, the mayor's right. We need an adequate water supply. But it appears that despite huge expense and the boasts of city officials, including the mayor, we don't have a secure water supply. Well, the mayor also addressed transit. He asked the community to answer a few questions such as, should we have more stops to pick up and drop off riders? Should we run later hours during the week and on weekends? And should we find new partners to extend our service area and help with costs? Well, the problem with questions like these are that citizens don't have all the information needed to make an informed answer. Would we like to have more bus service? Well, who could answer no to such a question? But if the mayor had told us that the cost per passenger mile for Wichita Transit buses is 95 cents, and that's not the cost to drive a bus a mile, that's the cost to drive a single passenger 1 mile. Or if he had told us that only 30% of the operating costs are paid by fares, people might answer these questions differently. And by the way, that 30% would be lower if we included the cost of capital, that is, the cost of the buses. And when the mayor asked citizens to weigh in at the Activate Wichita website, well, I looked, and there's no topic for transit there. But even if citizens were informed of these costs, their answers are still not fully reliable. That's because of the disconnect between the payment for the service and the actual bus service. Because so much of the cost of providing bus service is paid for by someone else, we don't really see the total cost of a bus trip. That's often a problem with services provided by the government. Since someone else is paying, there's not the same concern for receiving value as there is when people spend their own money. Well, that Activate website, by the way, do you remember when we looked at that? When citizens are asked to rate ideas, to express their approval, or, well, that's the problem. Your choices for voting on an idea are I love it, I like it, it's okay, or neutral. That's it. There's no voting option for expressing disagreement or disapproval with an idea. Neutral is as much dissent as Wichitans are allowed to express in this system. And on this system, the city leaders say they rely for gathering citizen input. There needs to be a voting selection that expresses disagreement or disapproval with an idea. Otherwise, when votes are tallied, the worst that any idea can be is neutral. And city leaders may get a false impression that all these ideas are fine and dandy. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. Well, on the topic of citizen involvement, the mayor told us this in his State of the City address this week. A few weeks ago, he said, the city launched the Office of Community Engagement. Well, that's something that the city probably needs based upon data the city itself has gathered. The Wichita Performance Measures Report holds some data from a survey called the National Research Center National Citizen Survey. And survey respondents were asked to rate the job Wichita does at welcoming citizen involvement. And the results are shown in the chart that you can see right now that I created from data in the most recent version of the Wichita Performance Measure Report. The numbers you see are the percent of respondents giving excellent or good as their response to the question. And the values for the last 3 administrations of this survey, well, you can see they're between 35 and 39%. The report says this performance is much below a benchmark set by the National Research Center. Well, the report tells us that the city expects to resurvey citizens in 2014 this year, and the city's given itself the lofty target of 40% of Wichitans rating the job the city does at welcoming citizen involvement as excellent or good. Well, maybe the Office of Community Engagement will help. And speaking of surveys, last year the city conducted an extensive survey of residents. Of this survey, the mayor said, "We learned that more than 70% of our residents are willing to rise above their personal interest to do what's best for the community." Well, the problem with this is that it relies on the false concept of a conflict between personal interests and what is good for the community. In the marketplace, which is the opposite of government, people advance their self-interests in one legitimate way, by finding out the goods and services that others want and then providing them. And if you can do this well and efficiently, you can earn profits. It's the quest for profits, that's self-interest, that drives people to figure out what others want and then to work hard to provide that. Everyone benefits in this case. This quest for profits could and should apply to areas that are under the control of government. But people are so afraid that someone will earn a profit by serving their fellow man. Recently, John Stossel, on his television show, spotlighted a park in New York City that is run by a private corporation with the aim of earning a profit. And people are happy with the new park. They feel safe, even though the park does not discriminate and still lets homeless people stay there. There's commerce going on, selling food, for example. People like that. And that's evident that this is the profit being earned. But Stossel's guest was critical and unhappy because someone was earning a profit, even though park patrons were happy with the park and most were unaware of its private sector operation. So when the park was operated by the city, for the common good that is, not many people used it. It was dirty and trashy, and people did not feel safe. Under the profit motive, people like the park and they use it. So where is the conflict between personal interest and what is good for the community? Now, not everything government does is bad, but when government dabbles in areas that the private sector can do very well, we often see problems. As an example, the city of Wichita wants to help real estate developers, but the city handled a recent situation so badly that the mayor apologized in his address saying, "We are also taking steps to ensure we have integrity and openness when we solicit proposals for development in the core area." And citizens that pay attention at City Hall also note that there are several small groups that contribute heavily to campaigns. Then the mayor and council members vote to give financial benefits to these same people. These are not isolated incidents. This behavior is repeated over and over, and some cities have laws against this type of behavior. But in Wichita, while we're being encouraged to put what is good for the community above our personal self-interest, we see City Hall run over by cronyism, that is, by people using city government for their own self-interest. Oh, they tell us, of course, in the name of the common good. Well, at the end of his speech, the mayor asked citizens to get into the game, saying, "We need you to be a player, not a spectator, to win a better and brighter tomorrow." But we've seen what happens when people want to be involved, but not in the way that the mayor and the council want. Do you remember the chart of airport data I showed you earlier today? Well, last year I presented that information to the City Council. And it so happened that Sedgwick County Commissioner Carl Brewer had appointed me to the Airport Advisory Board, and later in that same meeting the City Council voted on my appointment. And I was rejected. Only one council member voted in my favor. The Wichita Eagle reported Mayor Carl Brewer was clear after the meeting. The city wants a positive voice on the Airport Advisory Board, which provides advice to the council on airport-related issues. So I think we conclude a positive voice is more valued than a critical voice, it seems. You also remember when I showed you how Susan Estes of Americans for Prosperity testified at the meeting of the Wichita City Council. She cited a section of the Wichita City Code that says council members shall refrain from making decisions involving, among other things, friends and business associates. She asked the mayor to observe that part of the city code. But the mayor lashed out at Susan and others and threatened a lawsuit. Well, at least this year in his State of the City address, the mayor did not mention the importance of open and transparent government, as he usually does. Because based upon Activate Wichita, where there is no disagreement allowed, to rejecting board appointments simply because someone might be critical of the city's programs, to threatening those who ask the mayor and council members to follow the laws that they passed, to the city's hostile attitude towards the citizens' right to know, the message we get is this: the city welcomes your involvement, but only up to a point. Question the authority, and you're not going to be welcome. Well, that's the state of Wichita government, which I have to remind you is different from the many wonderful people who live here. And thanks for watching this episode of Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks.